The Hiss case demonstrated the intimate connection between communism and liberalism. Quote, "When I took up my little sling and aimed at communism," Chambers wrote in Witness, "I also hit something else. What I hit were the forces of that great socialist revolution, which, in the name of liberalism, has been inching its ice cap over the nation for 2 decades." The one ex-liberal who saw the connection clearly was President Ronald Reagan, who awarded the Medal of Freedom in 1987 to Whittaker Chambers. Asked why, Mr. Reagan replied, "Because 100 years from now, people will have forgotten the details, but I want them to remember that Alger Hiss went to jail as a traitor and Whittaker Chambers was honored by his fellow citizens." Hiss's conviction verified anti-communism as a potent element of American politics. It gave Bill Buckley and other fusionist conservatives a cause by which to unite traditionalist conservatives and libertarians against a common enemy, liberalism. The historian George Nash and others have argued persuasively that without anti-communism, there would have been no unified conservative movement beginning in the 1950s, and without a conservative movement, there would have been no presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater, in 1964, and no President-elect Reagan in 1980. Witness is an essential work of the conservative canon. It may have enlisted more American anti-communists than any other book of the Cold War. They included Reagan, who could quote from memory the first pages of the foreword for many years afterwards, William A. Rusher, longtime publisher of National Review, libertarian columnist and author John Chamberlain, and the Prince of Darkness, conservative columnist commentator Robert Novak. Whittaker Chambers was one of the great men of our time, wrote the conservative publisher Henry Regnery. Why? Because of his enormous talent as a writer, his steadfast courage in the face of a ferocious liberal campaign to destroy him, his witness to God's grace, and the fortifying power of faith. Whittaker Chambers placed every conservative in his debt and for all time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thanks to the organizers. I think it's probably fair to say that all professors have certain guilty secrets. And I have a big one, which I wish to confess in public for the first time this afternoon. And that is that although I've been teaching Cold War history all this time, and although I had certainly been aware of the importance of the book that we are talking about here today, and although my colleague Bev Gage over there has just embarrassed me by telling me that she has been assigning this book to her students ever since she came to Yale, the sad fact is, until Nathaniel persuaded me to do it, I had not actually read Witness. I take some consolation in Joseph Epstein's recent confession, which you may have seen in the Weekly Standard, that he has only just now got around to reading the Bible after all this time. And Epstein said in his commentary, he said, "There's great stuff there." Well, that's what I felt about Witness, as over the last 10 days or so, I have been reading it, every line of it, sitting up late, reading it. If you pass by my house, you can see a lonely light in the darkness of the house. That's my iPad that actually has Witness on it now. It was compelling. It really kept me up nights reading. And as Epstein says of the Bible, there is great stuff there. Just for example, the aphorisms that are embedded within it. Quote, "Men must do what they think right, not yield to what seems probable." There is wit in it. On the multiple Soviet spy apparatuses that operated in this country in the 1930s, Chambers comments, well, the Russians believe in bulk. There is faith reflected in it. Without God, one only organizes the world against God. There is distinctions are made about personalities in very fundamental ways, that there are differences, Chambers writes, in the pitch and purpose of life, in the soul's angle of vision. And yet, well before I got to the end of this long book, I found myself wishing that Whittaker Chambers, who was himself a famous and excellent editor, had hired one to work with him on this book. Because as Epstein says of the Bible, there are a lot of begats in it. Even sacred texts, Epstein implies, can stand to be shortened in places. And perhaps that's true of Witness, particularly as you move through the final half of it or so. So what I came away with was a sense of admiration, deep respect, combined with, as I went through it and got to know it better, some sense of exasperation as well, that I was hearing things, reading things that I hadn't read before. And that sense of admiration and exasperation really resonated with me. Indeed, it struck me as a very familiar emotion. And I got to thinking, where did that emotion come from, that combination of admiration and exasperation? I thought of my Yale students, who sometimes merit these contradictions, but I don't think it came from that. I thought of my own efforts to connect what I write with what I think, the exasperation here being the difficulty that I don't know what I think until I write. But the real reason I think that Witness evoked these mixed emotions in me as I read it came from the parallels that I saw to a more recently published book with which I had had a somewhat closer connection. It's rather unimaginatively titled George F. Kennan, An American Life. Now, I'm chagrined on going back and looking at my book that in its 800 pages, it certainly is not brief. There is not a single reference to Whittaker Chambers in it. And so I particularly appreciate the forbearance of Chambers' biographer, Sam Tannenhouse, for not mentioning this embarrassing fact in his long and thoughtful review of my book in the New Republic last winter. Kennan himself, I looked this up, did refer briefly but only obliquely to Chambers in the second volume of his memoir published in 1972, where Kennan took a couple of pages to say that he had followed the Hiss Chambers case carefully a quarter century earlier, but still was unsure, as many people were in 1972, of who to believe in that case, who was telling the truth. Well, of course, we know the answer to that question much more clearly now, thanks not only to Sam's biography of Chambers, but also to the courageous scholarship of Alan Weinstein and those others who have followed his pioneering work. Today, nobody can reasonably doubt the truth in the light, particularly of the evidence that has surfaced from Soviet sources in the last 20 years or so. Although, as a friend pointed out to me the other day, you can still get in trouble if you stand in the middle of certain side streets in Upper Manhattan and shout out, "Alger Hiss was guilty!" Now, what so strongly struck me in reading Witness for the first time, however, I think was less how well it holds up in the light of recent scholarship. That I had known about, that I had expected. But what I had not expected in reading this book were what seemed to me to be a number of eerie similarities between the personalities of Whittaker Chambers and the man that I have spent a lot of time with recently, not just recently, for the last 3 decades, George F. Kennan. These reside, I think, in the fact that neither Chambers nor Kennan fit categories. They did not fit the compartments. They did not fit the pigeonholes that we too easily seek to cram great personalities into. They just didn't fit. Cannon House wrote of Chambers that he was a unique blend of romantic poet, religious pilgrim, and political revolutionary. He goes on to say that Chambers' contemporaries never stopped quarreling about him. To some, he was a fascist, to some, a martyr, to most, a mystery. But now here's Tannenhouse on Kennan in his New Republic review. Quote, "One is hard-pressed to think of another public individual so consistently driven not merely to revise himself, but also to repudiate himself, agonizingly at times, with the result that his words can be summoned today in defense or in rebuttal of almost any foreign policy position, while Kennan can be cast in almost any light. Kennan has become his admirers, but also his detractors." So this got me to thinking about Plutarch. It got me to thinking about parallel lives. It got me to thinking about what would happen if you just, as a kind of brief intellectual exercise for a Friday afternoon, think about the parallel lives of George Kennan and Whittaker Chambers. If Chambers and Kennan were each like so few others, how much were they like each other? And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about. Now, chronologically, they're only close in part. Chambers, as most of you know, was born in 1901, Kennan in 1904. But Chambers lived only to the age of 60. Kennan lived to the age of 101, hence the delay in publishing the biography, the source of profuse apologies over the years to me from the subject of the biography. Kennan and Chambers are closer, it seems to me, in having had difficult childhoods marked by family tragedies. For Kennan, it was the death of his mother 2 months after he was born. For Chambers, it was the suicide of a beloved brother in his 20s. Both Chambers and Kennan had Ivy League educations, Chambers at Columbia, Kennan at Princeton, but neither, in the years that followed, ever felt part of any establishment. Both men were afflicted with a deep cultural pessimism that was rooted not in foreseeing another world war. It went back further than that. It's rooted deeply in the 1920s, in the post-World War I period. There were periods of optimism in the lives of Chambers and Kennan, but they're very brief. I would say for Chambers, it's his period as editor at Time in World War II. I would say for Kennan, it's his year at the National War College and then the early days of the policy planning staff, where he was able to make it work as he wished with the total support of General George Marshall, who had become Secretary of State. These periods of optimism were fleeting for both men. Both men sounded the alarm about Soviet intentions. Chambers to the Roosevelt administration through Adolf Berle as early as 1939 with no visible results. Kennan to the Roosevelt administration through his diplomatic reporting from Moscow in 1944-45, which he also felt to have been ineffective. Both men found themselves, as a result, isolated from many of their contemporaries, even ostracized for having gone out on these limbs. Although Kennan's vindication, of course, came far more quickly and far less painfully than that of Whittaker Chambers. Neither took satisfaction in vindication, however. Self-congratulation for both men, most atypically in the modern age, was almost impossible. That's remarkable in the 20th century.